Thank you, Kelsey. And lately, that screaming has been very angry screaming, but hey, it's all good. And I feel honored to be called your friend. I better say okay to that so that gets off the screen. All right. So thank you for that introduction. I always feel weird when someone else talks about me. Um, but I don't think there's anything more to say. I think that pretty much covered it. And so Kelsey had asked me to speak on the changes that have come with the new dietary guidelines. And as you noticed in the title that she had on her slide, um, I included what not has changed. And so there really hasn't been a significant amount of changes to these dietary guidelines. Um, and so hopefully I can fill an hour. But as I told Kelsey, you get me talking about nutrition and I could talk for days. So that shouldn't be a problem. But I wanted to first put this slide up here to kind of give you a background about what the dietary guidelines actually are. And so the dietary guidelines are updated every 5 years by the USDA and the Health and Human Services. And the purpose is to help guide federal nutrition policies. So things like school lunch, the Department of Corrections and military meals have to follow these guidelines. They also affect healthcare recommendations, nutrition education programs such as Meals on Wheels, and senior meal programs that some of you might be involved with. And so that is why these are created. And then every 5 years, there is a dietary guidelines advisory committee. And typically what occurs is there's a 2-year scientific review process to review the science and then create these guidelines that are presented. However, this year something different happened, and we created a new committee, and they call themselves the Scientific Foundation. And they created the document that you see the front page of here on the slide. And as you can see on the slide as well, this committee actually rejected 30 of the recommendations that original advisory committee that did the 2-year process had recommended. And you can find the report of what they rejected and accepted at realfood.gov. So if you go there, one of their first couple pages in this document shows you the 30 recommendations and what they, as you can see here, what they rejected I guess there's 56 recommendations, my apology. They rejected 30 of the 56 recommendations. They accepted as is 14 of the 56, and then they partially accepted 12 of the 56. And like I said, that report shows you exactly that. That's not me saying anything. That's crazy out there. And as I mentioned, these requirements, why it's important is these requirements are required to be followed for those nutrition programs. So our school lunch programs and your senior feeding programs are going to have to follow what these guidelines state. And so one of the major changes before I flip to the next slide where I'm going to go through some of these is the image you see here on this slide is this inverted triangle. And so that is now our graphic that we are supposed to be following. And I'll talk more about that later. But I don't have it on every slide, so I just wanted to make sure to point it out here. And so I found this chart as I was doing some research to get ready for this presentation, and I just thought it was pretty interesting. So it's showing you the evolution of the dietary guidelines all the way from 1980 to 2020. And you can see in there that there are changes, and that's okay. That is why we review these dietary guidelines every 5 years, is because, as we like to say, as Kelsey mentioned, I'm the host of a podcast. We like to say in a podcast that research is called research for a reason, because we are researching the information that we already know. And so these guidelines represent some of that new information that has come out. And like I said, I think that is okay. But I wanted to throw that up there because I just thought I had never seen a chart like this, and I thought it was very interesting. I couldn't find a new chart, but one of the things I want to make sure to point out is that the adherence to our dietary guidelines is what the true problem is. And so we have some changes that I'm going to go through here. But the US population is not adhering to these dietary guidelines. And so I couldn't find a new chart, but this chart actually came from the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines. And it's showing how the average Americans, or how Americans score on what's called the healthy eating index. And so that healthy eating index is how we evaluate people's diet. So there's a series of questions that people answer about how frequently they eat fruits and vegetables and so forth. And then they get a score out of 100. And so you can see all the scores here, but I did go and look up the new data. And so for the 60 plus age group, where we had 63 in this 2020 data, which is reflective of 2015, the new 2020 number is 61. So the healthy eating index has actually gone down for our senior population. And I didn't look up the other age groups, but I'm going to guess that you could probably see a similar uh, relationship where it might be going down on what we're eating. So I just always I'd like to start, I guess, presentations with this of that we as Americans are not following these dietary guidelines in the first place. But let's get into what those changes are. So here are some of the core changes that are that can be found in these new 2025, 2030 dietary guidelines. And as you saw in the image that we had on the second slide that I hung out there for a moment, we have a new redesigned inverted food pyramid. And so this is one of my biggest bones of contention about the new dietary guidelines is the food pyramid, because we haven't actually used the food pyramid since 2011. You probably all are familiar with My Plate. We actually changed into My Plate in 2011 away from the food pyramid because it was felt that the pyramid wasn't a very good visual of how we should be eating. Because I don't know about all of you, but when I eat my meals, I eat on a plate. I don't eat on a pyramid. So that visual was much easier to understand for people. But this new committee has decided to bring that back, and they inverted it. And some of the messages that I see when I look at that inverted pyramid are they have really prioritized protein foods up there at the top of that pyramid. Dairy foods, healthy fats, and fruits and vegetables are all at the top. And one thing that I notice is the whole grains have been moved to the very bottom, to the point of that inverted triangle is what I see when I look at that food pyramid. And again, we're going to go through some of those changes in some more detail. You can also see on here that they changed the protein priority. They have some differences in the fat and dairy guidance, and I have some individual slides for both of those things because that's where some of the biggest changes are. I have a slide referring to the added sugar changes that are there, but I don't have an individual slide for the alcohol component. And so for me, and I think many professionals, there's a noticeable lack of alcohol guidance in these new recommendations. And so the recommendations say to consume less alcohol. And in fact, the only recommendation that is written in this 100-page document about alcohol is that you should completely abstain if you have any sort of medical condition, such as pregnancy or medications that might interact with alcohol, or if you're an alcoholic. Those are the only times that you should completely abstain from alcohol, but instead you should just limit it. Where our previous guidelines had stated that it's 1 drink a day for women and 2 drinks a day for men, which when we were in college, we joked about, does that mean we can save up all of them for 1 day? But, that's neither here nor there. But I do want to point out that according to the World Health Organization, that alcohol is a class 1 carcinogen alongside tobacco and asbestos. And so there is really, truly no safe level of consumption related to cancer risk when it comes to alcohol. And so for me, that's kind of a glaring lack of recommendation in these dietary guidelines. And then the last point here on this slide is emphasis to avoid highly processed food. And in the dietary guidelines, I think it says emphasis to include whole foods. And so this is another change that I really struggle with that people are talking about, because that is not anything new for our dietary guidelines. We have always recommended nutrient-dense foods. However, there was not a specific recommendation to completely avoid highly processed foods like this new dietary guidelines is recommending. But the message has always been to kind of limit those highly processed foods and increase your whole food consumption. But I do think that this recommendation about completely avoiding highly processed food is really confusing, especially for our nutrition assistance programs like our senior meal programs, because the definition of highly processed foods is very unclear. There's we don't know what is considered highly processed, and so what we are not allowed to have on menus. So I think that requirement is, and I think the requirement for this gives you the idea that everything needs to be made from scratch. And I just can see that being incredibly problematic expense wise for some of these programs that are required to follow these dietary guidelines, such as our schools, our senior meal programs, and so forth. Um, so that is that. So on the protein requirement, they in the document, it recommends that you consume a variety of protein, and you can see here the ones that they list in that document. And where the change is here, I would say, is that it says, oh, and as well as protein sources, you can, or plant sources, excuse me, is where you can get your protein content from, where in the previous dietary guidelines, we highly recommend the use of plant-based protein sources to get our protein. But again, here there's a pretty big change that happened, is that they recommend a higher protein consumption. So it recommends that we actually get 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. And on the slide there, I changed that to pounds for you, because most of us know pounds instead of kilograms, where the previous recommendation, or well, I shouldn't say the previous recommendation. The recommendation, which comes from the RDA, which is the recommended dietary allowance, is 0.8 grams per kilogram. And so there is a lot of research around this level of 1.2 to 1.6 grams a kilograms of why we should have that much protein, especially with our aging population. However, this is really out of the scope of work of the dietary guidelines to recommend an actual level like this. Because again, like I said, we have that RDA that tells us what we should be consuming. So there's not necessarily a problem with this 1.2 to 1.6. I just feel that it's out of the scope of practice of the dietary guidelines to do that. But just for you to understand, the recommended dietary allowance, they figure out those numbers by telling us the average daily amount of nutrients needed to meet the requirements of 97 to 98% of healthy individuals in any specific age and gender group. So it's supposed to act as a goal for our daily intake. And it's there to prevent deficiency related diseases. It's not there to dictate optimal health. And so I think that's kind of key when we're talking about this 1.2 to 1.6, is the RDA amount is to prevent deficiency, where this 1.2, 1.6 might be more for that optimal health. So I guess you could make the argument that dietary guidelines are for optimal health, so that's why it's there. I feel like I had something else. Related to this number too, if we're increasing our protein consumption, it's very important though that we are also increasing our activity. And so increasing the amount of protein we consume without some sort of weight focused physical activity isn't going to do us any good. So a lot of times when I say there's a lot of research around this for seniors, seniors can increase their protein consumption, but just because we eat protein doesn't mean it turns into muscle without the subsequent physical activity to help turn that protein we ate into muscle. So I think that's just a very important message. If we're going to increase our protein, we also need to increase our physical activity to result in more muscle mass. The next thing, and the one I probably have the biggest challenges with, is the fat and dairy guidance has changed. Kind of. So again, the document reads that you should incorporate healthy fats such as meat, poultry, omega-3 fats, and full fat dairy. And you can see here that, and it also says cooking oils such as prioritizing olive oil, and then butter and beef tallow can be included. And if you look, I included the pyramid here again, because if you look at the things that are at the top of that, that pyramid, you see a beautifully marbled steak, as well as whole milk and things. And so they're clearly emphasizing that those are the types of proteins that you should be eating. And those are the type of proteins that have more fat in them. But the recommendation they have, if you, excuse me, if you read the written text, it suggests that in general, saturated fat consumption should not exceed 10% of the total daily calories. This is consistent with what the previous dietary guidelines said. It stated in that dietary guidelines we should not exceed 10%. But again, the list of foods you listed here of meats such as, and if you go back to our protein foods, it specifically says red meat. So if you go back to that recommendation plus the full fat dairy, I think you're going to have a really hard time staying within that 10% of your saturated fat guidelines. That is also recommended if you read the text. So to just kind of help you visualize what that looks like, when you look at a food label, that is based off of a 2,000 calorie diet. That's what all of your food labels are based off when it gives you everything on there. And so that would actually allow for you to have 22 grams of saturated fat in your diet if we do the 2% of the, or excuse me, 10% of the 2,000 calories. So for example, one cup, not a glass, because I don't know what people's glass sizes are, but one cup, measuring cup of whole milk is 5 grams of saturated fat. A steak, which is a 3-ounce serving of steak, which, if you aren't familiar, is a size of a deck of cards. So a 3-ounce serving of steak is 5 grams of saturated fat. And I don't know about any of you, but the last time I had a 3-ounce steak was never. If you go to the restaurant, normally they're giving you a 6-ounce serving. So let's double that because that's probably what we're eating. So 10 grams of saturated fat in a 6-ounce serving of steak. And if we have just 1 tablespoon of butter, which as you can see on this recommendation, cooking oils such as butter or beef tallow, which are equivalent, by the way, when it comes to saturated fat content, 1 tablespoon of that butter is 7 grams of fat. So we're up to 17 grams of saturated fat of the 22 we can have if we if we only drink 1 cup of milk, if we only have a 3-ounce serving of steak and a tablespoon of butter. So that's just contradictory in my opinion to say 10% of your total diet, daily calories from fat, but recommending those foods. And I said there's a 100-page document about this information, and I read it. And the only example they can give in that 100-page document about the argument for whole dairy products or full fat dairy products is yogurt. They give an example about yogurt and that when you take out the fat of yogurt, fat. So fat and sugar both provide us with texture of our food and mouthfeel. And so when you remove the fat from yogurt, you have that nice, creamy, lovely mouthfeel that you get when you have something that's full fat. And so if you remove that, you no longer have that creamy texture, which requires you to add some other sort of additive to our food to give that mouthfeel back. And so that is the argument for why we should use whole products versus reduced fat products. Do with that what you will. That's the example that was given. I guess I can understand that. Full fat dairy, though, is one of those things that I don't tend to have a huge problem with because we have fat soluble vitamins of A, D, E, and K. And those are typically, you need fat in order to absorb those vitamins. And so, especially vitamin D, for example, one of the really only places we get it from in our diet is from dairy products. And so having a whole milk to help absorb those fat soluble vitamins, that's not one of those hills I'm going to die on personally. But something that has come to my attention lately when people are talking about full fat or whole milk is I think they're getting it confused, which this did not occur to me at first. They're getting it confused with raw milk. So some of these people who are celebrating full fat milk, whole milk as being on the dietary guidelines think that it's raw milk. And those two things are not the same thing. Whole milk and raw milk are two totally different things. Raw milk means it hasn't been pasteurized and, for the record, is not safe for consumption for other reasons. So I just wanted to make sure that point was clear too, that whole milk and raw milk are not the same thing. That was not something that ever occurred to me when this discussion first started. But I do want to point out in this discussion that, because there is a lot of discussion about saturated fats right now, is the scientific consensus is that saturated fat increase risk of heart disease. And that when we replace saturated fat with our monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, we have positive heart health benefits. And so this particular recommendation is very concerning to me for that reason of the saturated fat content. And so just to help understand that too, monounsaturated fats, we know help lower LDL cholesterol, which is that bad cholesterol, while they maintain HDL cholesterol, which is our good cholesterol. And then the polyunsaturated fats, which is listed here, omega-3, omega-6 are also some other examples of those polyunsaturated fats. Again, they also help lower our LDL cholesterol, which is that bad cholesterol. Well, saturated fats increase that LDL cholesterol. And so we know we don't want increased LDL cholesterol. We know that is a precursor to cardiovascular disease and a bad thing. And saturated fats are typically found in butter, tallow, red meat products, any animal product in general has saturated fat. And then I will just point out too, which this isn't really a big problem, but trans fats is maybe another fat you've heard about. And so synthetically made trans fats increase your HDL, or excuse me, increase your LDL and decrease your HDL. So it's a double whammy and is really bad for your health. And so they actually in 2018, I believe is the date, they removed trans fats from this food supply. So it's really not an issue. You should not be able to find food with trans fats in it. But I do want to point those out. And then the other one I mentioned is that they are really recommending the limit of highly processed foods and added sugars. And in the document, it says, well, no amount of added sugar or non-nutritive sweetener is recommended or considered part of a healthy or nutritious diet. One meal should contain no more than 10 grams of added sugar. So it's saying that don't have any, but don't have more than 10 grams ultimately. And again, in the previous dietary guidelines, it was recommended that you don't exceed 10% of your daily calories from added sugar, which would equate to about 16 grams per meal. So if you want to kind of see how that compares to what the original recommendation is. And again, the podcast, we had a host or guest on the podcast one time who was on this dietary guidelines recommendation, and he said that 10% was still too high for the added sugar, but like the US population is so far away from that 10% of our goals. We went with 10% because that's an improvement. But yes, it still should be lower. And so, yeah, again, this isn't something I see any problems with that we need to limit it. I just think it's probably going to be a challenge. And the reducing processed foods and refined grains. So refined grains are like your white breads. Those again have always been a recommendation that we should be reducing those things. We know that added sugars can worsen diabetes control. It can lead to diabetes. It can increase inflammation. And then oftentimes we know too that highly sweetened foods can displace those protein-rich foods in our diet and any other nutrient-rich foods. So we're well aware of the impact on health that processed foods and added sugar foods have on our diet. And it's always been recommended that we should be reducing those. But they're so convenient to grab, so it's very hard to do that. And again, I want to pull up, this is from the previous dietary guidelines, but again, it is showing where we are on the intake of these foods. And so it is recommended that we have 3 cups of vegetables a day. And as you can see here in this chart, only 10% of the US population was meeting that 3-cup requirement. Fruits, we're supposed to only have 2 cups. I mean, you can have more, but the recommendation is to have at minimum 2 cups of fruits a day. It looks like 20% of the population meets that. If we go over to our grain category, 2%, a week, 2% of our population is getting the whole grains that we're supposed to have. But man, are we meeting that refined grains, exceeding that refined grains number. Like we're blowing it out of the park there. And you can see there the dairy and poultry, or not poultry, excuse me, dairy and protein foods, and where we stand in those, which seafood is kind of the concerning number there when it comes to those numbers. And then when we talk about those things we're supposed to be limiting, because in the previous dietary guidelines, we were still limiting these things, you can see here that, let's say 61% of the population is exceeding that 10% of our added sugar. 2% of the population is exceeding the saturated fat 10% recommendation. And gosh, look at that sodium, almost 100% of men are exceeding the sodium recommendation. So we are knocking it out of the park on these foods that we should be limiting, but we're struggling with those foods we should be consuming. So like I said, while the the recommendations haven't changed much. The concern really is in our adherence to what these recommendations are. And so we really need to work on that. And one of the other things that is not in the dietary guidelines, it's something that is noticeably missing, in my opinion, is that there is no recommendation for vegetable subgroups. So if I go back to this chart here, you can see under the total vegetables where I said 10%, that we have dark green vegetables, red and orange vegetables, beans, peas, starchy vegetables, and other vegetables. So those are the subgroups of the vegetables. And there's absolutely nothing in the new dietary guidelines about these subgroups. And just for information, previously, beans, peas, and lentils, it was recommended that you have 1.5 cups per week of those, 1.5 cups of dark greens a week, red and orange, 5.5 cups a week, starchy vegetables, 5.5 cups a week. And so there were specific recommendations for that. And so my concern here is that while we need to have 3 cups of vegetables a day without explaining what vegetables we should have of these subgroups, that Americans are going to continue to consume the number one vegetable that is consumed in the United States in the form of a French fry, probably fried in tallow, to meet these vegetable requirements. So are we going to see an improvement in our adherence? I don't know, maybe. But is our improvement in adherence because of French fries? And that's something that's very concerning to me, because like I said, this is the number one vegetable in this form consumed in the United States. But is this going to really help us achieve optimal health? And in my opinion, it will not. So again, because I know you guys work, and I went through this presentation way too fast, so my apologies, but no one ever has a problem getting time back. But so because you guys are working with older populations, I wanted to put in here what these guidelines can mean for older adults. And so it's going to be very, very important that nutrition is a priority for these older adults, because as the second point here says, that the older adults have a decreased calorie need, but that nutrient need is still very high. And so having those nutrient dense foods for these individuals is going to be imperative to help make sure they're maintaining their health. And they need their protein foods. And so that higher protein content is probably going to be good. They need to be concentrating on vitamin B12, which is highly present in animal-based proteins. So again, that could be helpful there. Vitamin D and calcium, which can be found in our dairy products. And so those are some things that will support our older adults. And it's important that they're getting these, because these nutrients are going to support muscle strength for them. It's going to help them recover from illness. There's going to be some immune function support by getting our vitamins and nutrients. Bone health for older adults is incredibly important. And so that vitamin D and calcium is really significant there. Cognitive health, as you know, is another concern from our older adults. And so making sure we're getting those nutrients for that as well. And of course, our goal is to keep them independent. And so helping with that is always going to be important. And most older adults have inadequate protein and nutrient intake. You can see my final bullet point here too of hydration and fiber. Is these aren't really nutrients, but they're food components that are very important for our for everyone to have, but especially our aging population. And as you guys know, older adults have decreased thirst sensations, so they're unlikely to be drinking, which will lead to dehydration, and that leads to confusion. It can lead to UTIs, and we all know that UTIs really cause some extreme confusion. And then falls can also happen here, and we really don't want our older population falling. And then the fiber is important just for them as it is anybody else for our gastrointestinal movement to get things moving through. Some older adults really have some problems with constipation. And so having that fiber intake is important. But I always caution everybody to remember, because right now it's trending to be fiber maxing. You cannot increase fiber without increasing water. So fiber grabs all of that liquid from that you have in your body and absorbs it to help things move through. So if we're not having enough hydration and water consumption, then we're not going to have the movement that we're hoping for. And instead, we're going to result in some constipation, which you were hoping to get rid of in the first place. So just make sure that that fiber does also come into play with the hydration. And that's pretty much all I have on those new dietary guidelines. Because, like I said, there wasn't a significant amount of changes. And I did kind of cover some of that fast. But as Kelsey mentioned, I am the host of the Bite by Bite Nutrition for Life podcast, a co host. And so here is just a screenshot. You can find us on any of your normal Spotify, Apple podcast, any of your podcast apps. But we release an episode a month, and so you can find all of those. And I thought it was interesting that the screenshot I chose to take was we did an episode on seed oils, which is what some of this promotion of beef tallow and things is about, is people think that seed oils cause issues. So you can listen to this episode and find out why seed oils aren't a concern, as well as many other episodes on things. And then Kelsey also asked me to provide you with some resources that you could find um, to provide nutrition information. So the National Institute of Aging does have some information related to seniors and nutrition. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is always a good place to go. And right now they have a nutrition fact check that you can go to. And so I put the link there for that specific nutrition fact check. The Center for Science and the Public Interest. So that chart I showed you at the very beginning that had the changes in the dietary guidelines from 1980 to now, that is where that came from. And so they have a bunch of information on there currently about the new dietary guidelines and any concerns they have. And they're doing some work with the schools and senior feeding programs on what that highly processed food discussion is and kind of how to meet that guideline. So they're doing some work there with that. I would also recommend any chronic disease site like the American Heart Association and American Diabetes Association, and then government sites. And I did put those last on here for a reason, but we don't have to go into those right now. But those should be places that you can find some reliable information to go to. And I think I see that the chat box is blowing up here. Yes. And that is all I have for slides. So
yeah, well, thank you, Monica. We'll continue to check the chat, or if anybody has questions. We do have a short evaluation at the end of each of our webinars, so I'm going to put that in the chat right now, so that if anybody's got to hop off, they're able to do that before you leave the webinar. So that's in the chat. I wanted to just say that, this is a lot of information, and I learned a lot from you, Monica. So thank you very much. And I think there's just a lot more that we can learn, and that we'll continue to find more information to help our older adult population understand some of the important aspects that this brings to their livelihoods. So does anybody have any questions for Monica? Oh, there's one here. Can you deepen more about ultra processed foods?
Yeah. So I'm looking through the chat box, and I was going to say, is it Tashara? I crocheted my sweater that I have on today. So exciting. I know, not related to the question. And Lacey, I completely agree that I'm very sad about moving away from my plate, because I do think it was a good visual. But we've been having some discussions on my plate, and like, was anyone following it? Kind of like the adherence thing I had mentioned. So the ultra processed foods, I don't know what you're specifically asking there, but we have, oh gosh, I can't think of what the scale is called right now. But there is a scale where they're measuring ultra processed foods and determining which ones should not be used and which ones should. And so it's like there are 4 different levels on that scale. But the problem is there can still be some pretty healthy foods with ultra processed foods. So we actually did a podcast episode on ultra processed foods, and we had someone from the soy industry come. And so there's a lot of like your plant-based meats, so your Beyond Burger and those sorts of things related to soy, that those can be really important foods for people who are choosing not to eat meat to consume, but that's considered ultra processed, highly ultra processed. And so that's a real challenge. And so that's where it's very unclear. Are we following that scale? I wish I could think of the name of that scale right now, and I can't. Uh, are we following that scale? What
Someone
scale are
put
we
into the
following?
chat,
Someone put it in there.
Chandra put Nova. Is that
Yes, the Nova scale.
that
Thank
it?
you.
Okay.
Yep, the Nova scale is how they're determining it. Well, I guess I don't know if that's what they're using to determine it in the dietary guidelines, and that's part of the problem. Um, but like I said, there can be some perfectly healthy foods that are considered processed foods. It's concerning too for me regarding affordability of food. So there sometimes those processed foods can be very affordable for people, and so that can also pose a challenge. And I oftentimes think of cereal. So cereal, lots of times, is an ultra processed food, but that is providing their tend to be fortified with many nutrients that we lack in our diet. And so even though some of them are very sugar sweetened, and I don't love that, they can tend to provide some very important nutrients that our children are missing, especially if they're in a low income situation, and maybe not getting the food that they need. Joe, should we stop
Okay.
promoting my plate? Great question, and I'm not the person to answer that. It is not technically what is to be utilized right now, but I can't say that I have changed.
Yeah, that's probably institution to university kind of recommendations.
Yeah, and I do
Yeah.
know, so for Purdue, we have our Dining with Diabetes program, and we use a different type of plate in that one. And the Diabetes Association actually has a diabetes plate, which is very similar to my plate. Um, so there are some options out there that still signify a plate. And I agree, Christine. I think it's still a great graphic.
Can you advise on cheese and best options for seniors?
Can you elaborate on what you mean by on the
James.
cheese question?
Well, this is James from Central State University in Ohio. So thank you for sharing today. So I just had a session yesterday, and when we was talking about that, they was like, I love cheese, I love cheese, love cheese. And it was like something about full fat processed cheese to kind of stay away from. But then it was like, well, what kind of cheese can I have? And I was like, you know what? Let me get back to you on that. And then you happen to be here today. So I don't know. How to elaborate other than that's what they asked me yesterday in my class.
Well, that helps. That helps. So, and agreed. I love cheese. Please don't take cheese out of my life. So most cheeses are pretty high in fat. Like you're going to have a hard time finding a very low in fat cheese. So there's that. Um, but one of the things I like to recommend sometimes if people are trying to reduce the fat content from their cheese is to use a hard cheese. So like a Parmesan cheese, because it's still high in fat. It's a very high fat cheese, but it has a more robust flavor. So you'll use less of it. Is tend to what I recommend. You can get lower fat cheese options. I know they make like mozzarella as lower fat. Personally, when you get the lower fat cheese options, I don't think they taste very good. So for me, I'm more of a eat your regular whole fat cheese, but just try to limit how much of that you're consuming. And I mean, yeah, there's like Velveeta. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if there's any dairy in Velveeta. So there is some highly processed cheese. So if you're going with your like cheddars and that sort of thing, you should be in good shape there.
Yeah. Would you recommend from the call it from the block versus what's already prepackaged? You know what I
Do you
mean?
mean like block for shredded?
Yeah. Yes.
So I don't have a recommendation there. But one thing I guess that might be the argument there is shredded cheese does have it's typically like a cornstarch
Mhm.
coating on it to keep it from caking in the
Yeah.
package, because if you don't have that anti-sticky, that it'll coat. And so that could add some extra carbohydrates to the cheese that aren't typically there. And then if anyone has any sort of issue of needing to avoid that. But otherwise, and it's minimal that I wouldn't worry about it that much as far as the carbohydrate content. Personally, when you shred the cheese yourself, it's more delicious. But I buy shredded cheese personally at home.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. And there is vegan cheese options out there. I've not had them. Some people say they're great. Some people say it's not so much. So,
They just don't melt as good as others.
yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My name is Dr. Joseph Frank, and with the CSU, and my question goes along with asking about the issue of red meat. I don't know if I missed portion of it or it hasn't been talked about. How is it still being said that red meat in large consumption might be not a good idea or in moderation? Number one. Number two, what about what is being used to replace my plates? Because it hasn't to be very popular whenever we do a program. We direct people to my plate, which hasn't to be very specific and simple to understand. Um, yeah, so far, let me stop there. That way you can probably, thank you.
Sure. So when you asked about the red meat, that is one of the things with these dietary guidelines. I'm trying to make that note. There we go. That they kind of emphasize red meat in these dietary guidelines, and that's what's pretty. It is concerning. Red meats typically tend to be high in saturated fat, which we know is a concern. So these dietary guidelines recommend it. Personally, it's not something that I think you should be going and eating large quantities of. But red meat does have some values as well of, like we talked about, B12. And so getting your B12 nutrients is really prevalent in your animal-based products. So needing that. Iron is another, so if someone has iron deficiency anemia, your red meats are going to be important for that as well. So there's certain medical situations and when so red meat might be important, but in those situations, I would recommend having a lower fat red meat. So when you buy ground beef, you can buy ground beef as lean as 93.7, and you can buy it as fatty as 70.30. So trying to have those leaner cuts, sirloin would be a leaner cut of beef than what's pictured in the graphic, which looks like a T-bone or something. That has quite a bit of fat on it. So yes, these dietary guidelines seem to be really kind of recommending red meat, but that is something that's of a little bit of concern to me with my background. And when you asked about what is being used in place of my plate, this graphic, this inverted pyramid, is what they are using to show what we should be eating. And so, like I said, there you can see the first thing I see when I look at this picture is that steak. And so you can see that that's at the top. One of the things I didn't mention either is I don't think there's a single bean on this pyramid. And that to me, beans are like, they say they're the magical fruit, but to me, they truly are a magical food and we need to be consuming more of them. And I can't tell if underneath that peanut, those are some beans or some peanuts. But yeah, there doesn't appear to be any beans on this pyramid. And that's another thing that's a concern to me. But this seems to be the graphic we're supposed to use.
That's about venison.
Okay. One more question, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I ask one more or somebody else?
Venison.
I think you're fine. Go ahead.
Yep, go
Okay,
ahead.
sure. What is the correlation between specific correlation between somebody being allergic to some food items versus eating healthy? Because I have that concern myself, maybe in my
So,
family.
so you're asking how they handle it if they have a food allergy?
Yes, there's some food allergy.
So, that's a great question. Obviously, if you have a food allergy, you shouldn't be eating that food. So without knowing what the food allergy is, I would say that you just really need to find an alternate food that can help provide you with that nutrient. And while I am always a food first person, if that's not feasible, using a supplement would be a great way. But like, for example, if you're talking about fish and omega-3s, so if you have a fish allergy and unable to get your omega-3s, you should not take a fish oil supplement. That is not going to be a good option. But maybe like walnuts are high in omega-3s as well. So trying to find an alternative food to get those in. But yes, food allergens can be a problem. But in that situation, I would recommend you work with a dietitian or your food allergist to kind of figure out what food you can substitute to get that nutrient.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And yes, I do think those are beans on top of that bowl of rice. And that concept comes from complete proteins, where you're supposed to have beans and rice together, which is also an outdated concept. I'm glad that the broccoli stands out to you, Kelsey.
Yeah, that's a big broccoli.
It is. I do love broccoli.
I'm kind of scanning through for other
I was saying,
questions.
just a shameless plug, though, a lot of these things are discussed on our podcast that we do. So if you have any questions about the seed oils, there was something else I said earlier and I can't remember what it is. But we talk about pretty much all of those things on the podcast. So it's a great place to get some information if you want. But I'm always open for you to send me a message and ask me questions as well. So I feel like I need to explain the beans and rice now more. So it's not an outdated concept in the fact that we need complete protein. So when we eat plant-based proteins, they don't have all of the amino acids in them that we need. So the idea was that you needed to eat two complementary plant-based proteins. So beans and rice, for example, are two complementary, that when you eat those things together, you will get all of the amino acids that you need. What is outdated about it is that you don't actually have to eat them together, that as long as you eat a variety of plant-based proteins throughout the day, you should be able to get all of your amino acids that are needed. So if I ate beans for breakfast but didn't have the rice till dinner, I would be perfectly fine. I don't have to have them at the exact same time, is what I meant by outdated concept there.
I put your email in the chat. Hopefully that's okay.
That's fine.
But if anybody has questions or want to follow up with Monica on something, a topic that perhaps would be really great to have on the podcast, I'm sure that would be great.
Is that nutrition fact check the one I said about ADA that someone put in here? Or is it something different? Oh yeah, it
Yes.
is. Okay.
Yeah, Monica, it is. I figured it's easier for a quick link for everyone.
Yes.
But those are great
Thank you.
resource. Yeah, thank you.
And I am also going to put the survey back in the chat, so that's refreshed and easy to access for you. I'll give it just another second if anybody thinks of another question, but I think we're at a point of wrapping up possibly. So just want to thank everyone for joining us. This was a great turnout for today's topic, which I think is very timely, and everyone's very interested in learning more about it. So I think that was great.
We can end it.
Sorry, I couldn't be more timely in February.
That's okay. That was a short turnaround for you.
That's fine.
So if there aren't any other questions, I do want to make an announcement that our normally scheduled monthly webinar that would have been for April, that's actually Good Friday. And so we are going to skip April's webinar because there might be a lot of folks off or institutions closed perhaps. So there won't be a webinar in April, but there will be one in May again. So you can always check that out at the NCRAN website and see what the May topic will be. It's not published yet. So stay tuned for emails and more information on the website for the May webinar. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. The sun just came out, so I'm really excited. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you all.